Hey everyone, Nigel and Luke here, and welcome to Crime Zone. If you've been watching our channel for a while now, then you likely know that we cover plenty of cases where it seems obvious that a given criminal was always doomed to fail at committing their crime. Either they were sloppy, didn't think things through, or maybe they acted in the heat of the moment to begin with. Well, today we wanted to try something a little different. Instead, we're going to be diving into two cases where criminals actually succeeded at what they were doing, only to get themselves caught because they couldn't help but push their luck. Before we get to today's stories, as always, if you find our videos interesting and informative, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. With that out of the way, let's get into the video. In the mid-1990s, the German public found themselves in the grips of a food safety panic. Poisoned items were popping up on grocery store shelves all over the country, and major companies were receiving extortion threats from dozens of unknown and unassociated individuals, each of whom said they wouldn't stop until they were handed large sums of money. While it's unclear who exactly started this trend of poisoning extortion cases, there was one criminal who arguably stuck out like no other during this time, both in terms of the economic damage he caused, as well as the bizarre way that he was finally brought down. His name was Alexander Nemeth. Nemeth was originally from Romania, and according to the German news outlet Der Spiegel, had become a naturalized German citizen just a year before he began his crime spree in the summer of 1996. What was particularly chilling about Nemeth's crimes is that unlike most other extortionists, he did not demand money right away. In fact, he would later claim that when he started poisoning food products, he had no clear motive. He wasn't in debt, and according to various reports, had an assortment of marketable skills, having worked as a trained locksmith, a landscape gardener, and a metalworker. According to Nemeth, the idea came to him by complete coincidence. First, he got obsessed with blackmail cases that he had read about and seen on TV crime thrillers. Then, he bought a box of books at a flea market. One of them just happened to contain instructions for how to make hydrogen cyanide, a highly toxic compound known both for its many industrial applications and, historically, as an incredibly potent poison. For the target of his crime, Nemeth chose the Swiss food giant Nestle, as well as a subsidiary company of theirs called Tomi. Tomi produces a wide variety of condiments, many of which are apparently offered in tubes. Nemeth selected two of the most popular condiments, mustard and mayonnaise, and began to poison these tubes in grocery stores beginning in August of 1996. He would do this at least 8 times over the next 2 years, each time spiking the condiments with more than enough poison to be lethal if consumed. Over this same period, Nemeth also sent 17 Nestle chocolate products to random people around the country that contained smaller amounts of poison. Additionally, he made at least one cyanide-laced drink, which he buried at a children's playground in the city of Cologne. While no one was killed by Nemeth's poisoned foods, what reportedly made the crime so alarming was the fact that he didn't just target one specific area. Throughout this 2-year period, he traveled to many different places across Germany, leaving the poisoned chocolates and condiments in at least 20 different cities. This tactic was hugely damaging to Nestle, who not only were forced to pull products from store shelves numerous times, but also saw a sharp decline in sales due to fear from the public caused by threats that Nemeth was sending to the company. Reports are not exactly clear about when he first started sending these threatening calls and messages, though it appears that even when he did and began to make demands, he initially did not include any formal plans to collect extortion money. In fact, if Nemeth had simply chosen to stop here, he might never have been caught. According to reports, at this point, all police really had on him was a taped recording of his voice from one of these messages, which they had released through a hotline in the hopes that it would lead to an arrest. Fortunately for investigators, Nemeth would make a mistake that would lead to his own downfall. It began in September of 1998, when Nemeth sent a bizarre final message to Nestle. He wanted 25 million Deutschmarks, or about $14 million US, worth of uncut diamonds in order for the product tampering to stop. Here was the strange part, though. The diamonds were to be delivered to him by a flock of specially trained carrier pigeons. For the last several months, Nemeth had been raising and preparing the birds on a small allotment of land located somewhere northwest of the city of Frankfurt. The message said that the 12 pigeons could be found in a car near the city of Dusseldorf, and that each of the birds would have a hand-sewn satchel around its neck. The diamonds were to be put into the satchels and the birds released so that they could fly back to Nemeth. While Nemeth obviously went to great lengths setting up his supervillain-esque plan, even remembering to equip the vehicle where the pigeons were left with untraceable license plates so that it could not be used to track him, the scheme had one glaring oversight. Nemeth had no control over what police put into the satchels that he had put on his pigeons. Instead of diamonds, authorities opted to put tiny radio transmitters inside instead, which they used to track the pigeons while they flew behind from a safe distance in a helicopter. Sure enough, the birds flew right back to the allotment where Nemeth had been raising them. A pigeon that authorities nicknamed Charlie was the first to arrive at the scene. When police interviewed people in the area, they told them that they had seen Nemeth sawing up and burning an old pigeon coop not long before. He was arrested a short time later at his apartment in the town of Eschborn. While Nemeth initially denied having anything to do with the poisonings, at some point he seemed to realize that the evidence against him didn't look great. When the case went to trial in the summer of 1999, he reportedly confessed in open court to what he had done during the very first day of proceedings. As previously mentioned, Nemeth would claim that the crime was never about money, or even blackmail, really. He said that his motives were a mystery even to him, and that at some point it became like an addiction. He further tried to minimize his responsibility by claiming that he was convinced no one could get hurt by his actions, because he assumed that the pungent smell left behind by the poison he used would make it obvious that the products had been tampered with. Prosecutors, however, did not buy this, and said that they believed Nemeth's confession was a calculated tactic for leniency, because he knew that the evidence against him was strong. They further pointed out that regardless of the fact that no one died, Nemeth's actions were extremely reckless, and not only induced a public panic, but cost Nestle an estimated $23 million in lost revenue. While Nemeth was ultimately sentenced to 11 years in prison for the crime, apparently this did not put a stop to the wave of extortion crimes that Germany was experiencing. A report from the time mentioned a claim from German authorities who estimated that they were receiving between 2 to 3 new extortion cases a week. Not all of these were within the food sector, though many were. Several copycats even targeted Nestle directly. Though it's not exactly clear what finally caused these types of crimes to go out of fashion, one theory we came across was that, like the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders, it was due to subsequent changes to product packaging, particularly within the food sector. Apparently, even in the mid-1990s, things like heat seals on packaged food items were not standard in Germany. Another possibility is that eventually, criminals realized the dismally low success rates of these types of crimes and simply moved on, as it appears that, like Alexandra Nemeth, most people were busted before they were ever able to collect their extortion money. At about 6 a.m. on the morning of June 11th, 1986, 40-year-old Sue Snow rolled out of bed at her home in Auburn, a city in King County, Washington, located roughly 30 miles south of Seattle. The day started off like any other Wednesday. After getting up, Sue started her morning routine more or less alone. Her husband, truck driver Paul Webking, had already woken up before her, and the two had exchanged a kiss and a sleepy "I love you" before Paul headed out the door. Sue, meanwhile, still had a little bit of time before she had to be at her job at the Puget Sound National Bank, where she worked as assistant vice president and bank manager. It was a good job, and one that Sue enjoyed. Though she was comfortable and happy these days in both her work and married life, Sue definitely hadn't always had it easy. She had dropped out of high school after getting married young, had been divorced twice, and had 2 daughters, one of whom, Cindy, was now an adult, and the other of whom, Haley, was 15 years old. That being said, Sue had worked hard to provide for her children, something that had eventually paid off for her at work. She had even found the time to get involved in local civic affairs and charity programs, and was known for her seemingly ever-present smile and her infectious upbeat personality. Her luck in the relationship department had been more of a recent development, as she and Paul had only been married for about a year. All the same, though, the two were madly in love, and were rarely apart outside of work. However, all of this would come crashing down that fateful morning, when at about 6:30 a.m., Sue's daughter Haley walked into one of the family bathrooms and found her mother lying unconscious on the floor. Sadly, Sue never woke up again, and by that afternoon was declared brain dead. Not long after, her family made the impossible and gut-wrenching decision to take her off of life support. Owing to the sudden and inexplicable nature of Sue's death, an autopsy was performed by the King County Medical Examiner. During the procedure, the examiner noticed something that stuck out to them. It was the smell of bitter almonds. This was noteworthy, since under the circumstances, the odor could have been indicative of cyanide poisoning. Sure enough, tests verified this suspicion not long after. Sue Snow had died of acute cyanide poisoning. That wasn't the only thing, though. Testing also revealed that the poison had come from a bottle of extra-strength Excedrin painkiller capsules. Sue had taken 2 of the capsules just minutes before she collapsed on the bathroom floor. When analysis was done on the remaining capsules in the bottle, 3 were also found to have been poisoned with cyanide. As it happened, Sue's husband Paul had taken a few pills for his arthritis from the same bottle that morning before leaving for work. By sheer luck, he had managed to avoid the poisoned capsules. Understandably, Sue's death became sensational news almost immediately throughout the state of Washington. And while authorities did look for signs of foul play, no one could think of anyone who could have possibly had a grudge against the 40-year-old woman. Instead, people quickly turned to the other, more terrifying possibility: that someone was tampering with random bottles of medication. This was at the forefront of many people's minds for good reason. Only 4 years earlier, the country had been gripped by one of the largest product tampering-related public panics in U.S. history, after randomly poisoned bottles of Tylenol had claimed the lives of 7 people in the Chicago area. The Chicago Tylenol murders, as they would come to be known, had led to a number of reforms to product packaging, but the original culprit had never been caught. For a time, the crime had also inspired a wave of copycats. Now, Seattle area residents worried that they might be the next ground zero for a wave of random poisonings. No sooner had this theory started to spread like wildfire in the local area than everyone's worst fears were confirmed. A second case of cyanide poisoning from a bottle of Excedrin capsules had been reported. This time, the victim was a 52-year-old man named Bruce Nickel, a heavy equipment operator who also lived in Auburn. Bruce had actually died 6 days before Sue Snow, but his death had initially been attributed to natural causes, the result of a chronic lung condition known as pulmonary emphysema. However, in the wake of all the news coverage about Sue's poisoning, Bruce's wife, Stella Nickel, had reached out to police, saying that she thought her husband might have been a victim too. He had collapsed after taking several extra-strength Excedrin capsules for a headache after work, and had died shortly after arriving at the hospital. Not only that, when Stella checked the manufacturing numbers on 2 bottles of Excedrin that she had bought, both were a match to the same batch that had killed Sue. These numbers had been widely publicized in the days following her death to warn consumers. Sure enough, when secondary tests were conducted on Bruce's body after Stella came forward, it was confirmed that his death had also been the result of cyanide poisoning. Additionally, both of Stella's bottles of Excedrin were found to contain more capsules that were laced with cyanide. Though recalls of extra-strength Excedrin had already started on a small scale by the time that Stella Nickel came forward, the revelation that a second person had died of cyanide poisoning in King County sent this process into overdrive. Excedrin's parent company, Bristol Myers, began telling retailers to pull all of their non-prescription capsule products off of shelves nationwide. The mayor of Auburn also declared a state of emergency. Thousands upon thousands of Excedrin bottles were checked for signs of contamination, and hundreds more were turned in by members of the public at the request of investigators. 2 more cyanide-poisoned bottles of medication were soon found, one at a grocery store in the nearby city of Kent, and another at the same store where Sue Snow had purchased her Excedrin. Interestingly, this last medication was different. It was not Excedrin, but rather another painkiller marketed under the name Anacin, which Bristol Myers did not own. This revelation was important because it showed that the source of the contamination was likely from product tampering at the retail level rather than some sort of issue at the manufacturing plant itself. Because the Excedrin products were the first ones found, Bristol Myers was the initial focus of suspicions. However, when their plant in North Carolina that had packaged the batch that had killed both Sue Snow and Bruce Nickel was inspected by the FDA, nothing out of the ordinary was found. Still, both Stella Nickel and Sue's family filed wrongful death lawsuits against Bristol Myers. At the same time, Bristol Myers got together with a group of other drug companies and offered a $300,000 reward for the capture of the person responsible for tampering with their products. With contamination at the factory now ruled out as the likely explanation for the deaths, law enforcement, who by this time had been joined by the FBI, turned most of their attention to finding a suspect. As part of this process, they naturally looked at the spouses of the 2 deceased victims and asked both Paul Webking and Stella Nickel to take a polygraph test. Paul agreed and did so, but Stella, who had started to drink heavily following her husband's death, declined. She said that she was too distraught over what had happened to participate. As far as Stella was concerned, this was just another tragedy in what had already been a fairly troubled life. She had grown up poor, and by age 16 was pregnant with her first daughter, Cynthia Hamilton. She moved across the country, got married, and had another child, but soon found herself in trouble with the law numerous times. In 1968, she was convicted for fraud. The following year, she was charged after physically abusing Cynthia, and in 1971, she was convicted of forgery. After serving 6 months in jail and going to mandatory counseling for the abuse charge, Stella sort of managed to get her life together. She met Bruce in 1974 and married him 2 years later, but both of them struggled with drinking problems. Eventually, Bruce sobered up and quit drinking altogether. As a result, Stella tried to do the same, taking up hobbies like ceramics and caring for tropical fish in several home aquariums. She also switched to evening shifts at her job at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, since she was no longer spending her nights at local bars. She and Bruce hadn't had a lot, and he was often out of work, but at the time of his death, it at least appeared that the couple had been working towards something. All that had now seemingly come to an end. Despite Stella's ostensibly plausible reason for not wanting to take a polygraph test, there was another thing about her that soon started to gnaw away at investigators. See, when she had initially reached out to police about Bruce's death and provided them with the 2 poisoned bottles of Excedrin, she said that she had purchased them on different days at different stores in the area. The more the detectives thought about this, the less it made sense. After all, there were only 5 poisoned bottles found during the entire nationwide recall. What were the chances that one woman just happened to purchase 2 of them at completely different stores on completely different days. When investigators did some more digging, they discovered that Stella had taken out several life insurance policies on Bruce in the year before his death. Further analysis revealed signs that Bruce's signature had been forged on at least 2 of these documents. Things got even worse for Stella when authorities did further examinations of the recovered painkiller capsules that had been poisoned with cyanide. All of them had traces of a mysterious green substance in them. This turned out to be an algae killer sold under the brand name Algae Destroyer, the same one that Stella used in her home aquariums. Detectives were now confident that they had found their culprit. When Stella finally agreed to take a polygraph test in November of 1986, she failed, further confirming the suspicions of law enforcement. Despite all of this, investigators still felt that they didn't have quite enough evidence against Stella and held off on making an arrest. That changed in January of 1987, when a surprise witness came forward: Stella's daughter, Cynthia Hamilton. Cynthia told police that her mother had repeatedly talked about wanting Bruce out of the way in the lead-up to his death. She said that she had grown bored with him ever since he got sober, and that she wanted more. She felt that the best way to do this would be to kill him and to make it look like an accident so that she could claim his life insurance payout. Cynthia claimed that her mother had even hinted at having tried to poison Bruce before, but that this had not worked. Cynthia also pointed police in the direction of the local public library. When police examined Stella's library records, they discovered that she had checked out numerous books about poisons, especially those that could be cultivated from wild plants. In a stroke of luck, when investigators fingerprinted some of these books, they were able to lift Stella's prints off of several pages specifically devoted to cyanide. After this, detectives felt that they had finally put together all of the chilling pieces of Stella's plan, and she was placed under arrest. Detectives alleged that after learning how to create the deadly cyanide capsules, Stella bought the Excedrin and tampered with it to kill Bruce. This had worked as intended, but Stella quickly ran into a problem. When Bruce died, his death was attributed to his chronic lung condition, and not the poison that she had used. While this meant that Stella had gotten away with her crime at this point undetected, because the death was ruled to be of natural causes and not accidental, she knew that it would create a difference in the life insurance payout. She would get $76,000 instead of $176,000. Stella wanted that extra $100,000, and she decided that she was willing to do whatever it took to get it. In order to redraw attention to Bruce's murder, therefore, Stella had randomly poisoned at least 3 other bottles of painkiller medication around King County in order to cause a tampering scare. This meant that Sue Snow's death had merely been collateral damage, a consequence of Stella deciding to push the crime further to get the rest of her money. It also came with an added bonus in her mind. If the crime got blamed on the drug manufacturers, she might win additional money in a wrongful death lawsuit. Unfortunately for Stella, she was sloppy. Perhaps the best example of this was the algae killer. Police theorized that they had found traces of it in all of the poisoned capsules because she mixed the cyanide used in the crimes in the same container she used to crush the algicide for her aquariums. Near the end of 1987, Stella was indicted by a federal grand jury on 5 counts of product tampering, including 2 which resulted in death. She was found guilty in 1988 and sentenced to 2 90-year terms in prison for Bruce and Sue's deaths, as well as 3 10-year terms for the other tampering charges. All of the sentences were to run concurrently. Interestingly, Stella was actually the first person to be convicted and sentenced under the U.S.'s new federal product tampering laws that had been created in the wake of the Chicago Tylenol murders. After being found guilty, Stella continued to maintain her innocence and appealed her convictions numerous times. These were all denied, though in one notable appeal, she and her lawyers accused her daughter Cynthia of lying about what she had told police in order to get the reward money offered by the drug companies. It's worth pointing out that Cynthia reportedly did actually get around $250,000 worth of this money eventually, and there are those that still speculate that she made the whole thing up. However, to our knowledge, no actual evidence of this has ever been produced, whereas the evidence against Stella Nickel is pretty damning. Stella's first opportunity for parole came in 2017, though she was denied. This past May, she filed a petition for compassionate release due to ongoing health problems, though according to records we came across, she is still incarcerated at FCI Dublin in Northern California. She is currently 79 years old, and if this request is denied, her scheduled release date isn't until July of 2040, when she would be almost 97 years old. As one final note, it's worth pointing out that because Stella was charged and convicted under federal product tampering laws, she was never actually charged with Bruce and Sue's murders. According to sources we came across, this technically means that if she ever gets out, the state of Washington still has the ability to bring charges against her. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a minute to thank our amazing supporters over on Patreon. As many of you are aware, our situation on YouTube always seems to be a bit uncertain, but our patrons help to ensure that we can continue to make content like this long term without having to worry as much about what surprises might be thrown our way. Plus, patrons also get access to 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. If you'd like to help support the channel directly, head over to patreon.com/crimezone to join. You can also find that link in the description below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and take care.